In a greatly simplified form, we have the 4 elements needed in every timepiece.
Just what do you expect after 25 years? Come on in, son, and make yourself at home.
Hey, you guys want to hear something?
That depends on what it is.
Well, this is too good to keep.
Hey, there's the bell. We better
Well, I got it. Easy, guys. See you back later.
This old switchboard could talk. Wow. Your ears would sizzle.
1880. We take Alexander Graham Bell's invention for granted today. Perhaps we should. But isn't it incredible that millions and millions of people can talk simultaneously to practically any spot on Earth? Back in the old days, the telephone was something of an oddity, to say the least. You'd pick up this receiver to see that the line was clear. Then you'd hang up and ring with this crank. Pick it up again and tell the operator what number you wanted. If there was anybody home, they'd answer and you could talk.
As long as we're alive, we got a chance. We got to find a flaw in his plan.
Oh, not a chance, fella. Not a chance.
Find a flaw in his plan.
Oh, not a chance, fella. Not a chance.
got to find a flaw in his plan.
Oh, not a chance, fella. Not a chance.
That's a telegraph message.
Yes. About 125 years ago, Samuel Morse invented the telegraph, a way to send code messages over an electric wire. The code was made by using different clicks for each letter of the alphabet. First message sent over 40 miles of wire was, "What has God wrought?" The telegraph was, and still is, wonderful.
Gotta make sure this is all can work correctly here.
New musical experience you can have.
Let's see. Check 1, 2, check. Check.
Let me show you something. Let me show you something.
following is a conversation with Oliver Stone. He's one of the greatest filmmakers of all time, with 3 Oscar wins and 11 Oscar nominations. His films tell stories of war and power, fearlessly and often controversially, shining light on the dark parts of American and global history. His films include Platoon, Wall Street, Born on the 4th of July, Scarface, JFK, Nixon, Alexander, W, Snowden, and documentaries where he has interviewed some of the most powerful and consequential people in the world, including Fidel Castro, Hugo Chavez, and Vladimir Putin. And in this conversation, Oliver and I mostly focus our discussion on Vladimir Putin, Russia, and the war in Ukraine. My goal with these conversations is to understand the human being before me, to understand not just what they think, but how they think, to steelman their ideas, to steelman the devil's advocate, all in service of understanding, not derision. I have done this poorly in the past. I'm still struggling with this, but I'm working hard to do better. I believe the moment we draw lines between good people and evil people, we'll lose our ability to see that we're all one people in the most fundamental of ways, and lose track of the deep truth expressed by the old Solzhenitsyn line that I return to time and time again, that the line between good and evil runs to the heart of every man. Oliver Stone has a perspective that he extensively documents in his powerful, controversial series, The Untold History of the United States, that imperialism and the military-industrial complex paved the path to absolute power, and thus corrupt the minds of the leaders and institutions that wield it. From this perspective, the way out of the humanitarian crisis and human suffering in Ukraine, and the way out from the pull of the beating drums of nuclear war is not simple to understand, but we must, because all of humanity hangs in the balance. I will talk to many people who seek to understand the way out of this growing catastrophe, including to historians, to leaders, and perhaps most importantly, to people on the ground in Ukraine and Russia. Not just about war and suffering, but about life, friendship, family, love, and hope. This is the Lex Friedman Podcast. To support it, please check out our sponsors in the description. And now, dear friends, here's Oliver Stone. You're working on a documentary now about nuclear energy.
Yes.
So it's interesting to talk about this. Energy is such a big part of the world, about geopolitics of the world, about the way the world is. What do you think is the role of nuclear energy in the 21st century?
Good question. And first of all, obviously, everyone's talking about climate change, right? So here I wake up to that a few years ago, and clearly we're concerned. I picked up a book by...
If anyone hasn't ever seen Lex Friedman or any of these interviews, this is one of the newer ones. I just thought was interesting. He interviews a lot of people you don't see get interviewed very often. And it's probably because of his status at MIT. But Lex is Russian, Lex is American. I think it's worth it to listen to. I hope you enjoy it. So go over to Lex Friedman's channel. Give him a follow.
Josh Goldstein and his co-author, who's Swedish. Those two wrote a book called Bright Future. A Bright Future. It came out a few years ago, and I lapped it up. It was a book, fact-based, clear, not too long, and not too technical, and it was very clear that they were in favor of all kinds of renewables, renewable energy, yes. They hated, made it very clear how dangerous oil and gas were, methane, and made it very clear to the layman like me, and at the same time said that this renewables could work so far, but the gap is enormous as to how much electricity this world is going to need in 2, 3, 4 times we don't even know. We have India, Africa, wanting more and more. that gap. The only way in their mind is to build a reactor. Starting now, they make that. Obviously, the country, the United States, is incapable of having that kind of political and good things, many good things, confusing, confounding the landscape, making that exactly. So taking all these things into consideration, we set about making this documentary, which finished now, almost finished. It's an hour and 40 minutes, and it was a hard part getting it down. 3.5 hours. Just something more reviews on road. Russia, France, which is the most advanced nuclear country in Russia, and the United States and talk to the scientists there as well as the Department of Energy people they're doing a lot of advancements. Russia gave us a lot of very cooperative because they have some of the most advanced nuclear, actually probably the most advanced nuclear investigation there. And they have some very advanced reactors on their building. They're building again. They have the green power, just not into power. The factor in France, when Hollande was president, decided to move away from it, actually beginning to just abandon it. And then close down some of the reactors. Thank God France did not do that. And my phone came in recently to reverse as fast as they can now, especially with these going on. Russia will not be providing the energy Europe needs. So, and then China is the other factor. I'm talking about the big boys. They are doing tremendous work very fast. Coal continues to be they too. Basically, coal in India and China are the biggest users of coal. All these factors globally. So we try to achieve a consensus. They're looking at where the real people more working with them on China and Russia. Now, France is the only one that's not putting it out. All the talk, all the nonsense about renewables and the new lifestyle and all this, it's great for your guilt complex, but it doesn't do anything for the total accumulation of carbon dioxide in the world.
Who's going to lead the way on nuclear, do you think? You mentioned Russia, France, China, United States. Who's going to lead?
I don't think it's going to be a United Nations kind of thing because the world doesn't seem capable of uniting. We go to these conferences, Kyoto, and we talk and we agree, but then we don't actually enforce. So I don't think it can happen that way. I think it's going to be an individual race with countries. They're going to just do it for their own self-interest, like China is doing. China, the thing is, if it works, and I'm praying that it will really work on a big scale, China will back away from coal naturally. The same thing will be true of India. They will see the benefits, because if you go to India, you see the cities, the pollution. You walk around in that stuff, and you get, there's no hope in this, and you sense it. So people will move in this direction naturally because nuclear is clean energy. And the amount of casualties of nuclear is the lowest on the industrial scale for energy producing, from coal down to oil, everything. The lowest casualty rate, very lowest, 0.002 or something, is nuclear. So not that many people have died from nuclear. Not that many. I think 50 people at Chernobyl, which was the worst accident. Nobody died at Fukushima. Nobody died at 3 Mile Island. And
Should be able to hear better. Sorry about that.
And over again. These accidents. The environmentalists have sold us the idea that they're dangerous. And it's a lot of environmentalists, thank God, are changing. They've come off that routine and they've saying, we were wrong. We've done a lot of good work. Greenpeace did a lot of good work. Whales, saving this, saving that. But they admit themselves, not they don't, but people who have been in the organization have said, we were wrong. In 1950, we show the articles in the New York Times that came out, the Rockefeller Foundation, which of course is a big producer of oil, the Rockefeller family, and the foundation came out with a study which was weighted. They tipped the scale, put a thumb on the scale, but it was a scientific expose of radiation in the study that came out printed in the New York Times, because the New York Times publisher Sulzberger was on their board. He was one of the board members. So they got a lot of strong publicity condemning radiation which started the process of doubting nuclear energy. The radiation levels that they pointed out were very minor. And of course, if you go into a scientific analysis of this now with what we know, it's just not true. But it tilted the scale back in the 50s, 60s, and started the questioning the nuclear business.
Do you think that was malevolence or incompetence?
No, I think it was competition. I don't think it was conspiracy as much as it was a sense that we don't want this. Nuclear energy is going to end the dominance of oil. Absolutely. And it will. Yeah. And it will anyway, because it's the only sane way for the world to proceed. But the world will have to learn through adversity. So in other words, the situation could get worse, much worse. And certain countries are just going to have to adapt like we always do. When things become too hard, you have to change your thinking.
And humans are pretty good at that.
Yes, talking about human nature, they're very adept at that. Germany, for example, I mean, when the Fukushima happened, they went out of the nuclear business. That was shocking to me. They just pulled out and they destructed several of their nuclear reactors that were still functioning, and put up coal, put up coal and oil, replaced it. And as a result, Germany drifted into this place next to France. Their electricity bills went up, and France stayed the same. They don't have that. They have a different system in Europe, but more or less, no question that France was doing a lot better than Germany. And now, with this Ukraine issue, it's a very interesting fulcrum point whether Germany is what direction they're going to go now. How can they keep going with coal? They just can't.
What's the connection between oil, coal, nuclear, and war? Sort of energy and conflict. Do you see, when you look at the 21st century, when you were doing this documentary, were you thinking of nuclear as a way to power the world, but is it also to avoid conflict over resources? Is there some aspect to energy being a source of conflict that we're trying to avoid?
I don't have the history of energy at my fingertips, and it's a very long history here. But I would say, apparently not. It does seem that individually each country can answer its needs by building, and up until now we haven't had conflict except in this issue of Russia supplying Europe. Obviously the pipeline. Nord Stream 2 has been closed, and Nord Stream 1 is also probably going to be phased out. And the concept of Russia supplying gas to Europe is now up in the air. and who knows what's going to happen. I just don't see how Europe can get away from using Russian gas. But Russian gas is not the solution because it's methane too, and it goes up into the atmosphere. Methane is in the short term is worse than coal. Worse. There's all kinds of charts we show in the film. We try not to be too over-factual, but methane is not the answer. It's a short-term answer. Will countries go to war over energy is a question that I'm trying to think of all the wars that happened. You could say Germany, of course, during World War II needed oil very badly, and it dictated their strategy with Romania, etc., and getting the oil fields open. But I haven't thought that one through. I'd have to make a documentary on it to really understand how energy and war interface.
It's always part of the calculation, but it's a question of how much. Right, that's the question. I just have to ask, because you mentioned your mom was from France. You've traveled for this documentary, and you traveled in general throughout the world, in Russia, Ukraine. What are the defining characteristics of these cultures? Let's go with Russia. So as I told you, I'm half Ukrainian, half Russian. I came from that part of the world. What are some interesting, beautiful aspects of the culture of Russia and Ukraine?
I can't really speak honestly of Ukraine. I was there only in 1983 when I visited the Soviet Union under the communism. And Kiev was beautiful. It was one of the nicer places I went. But they were very much stultified by the communist system. They all were. The best places to visit in Russia were always in the south, whether Georgia or the Muslim countries. There was always a better culture in terms of comfort. But communism was rough, and that was the end of it, pretty much. Brezhnev regime, and then Andropov. Gorbachev was 3 years in the future when I was there. So I can't talk about Ukraine, and they're not been friendly to me since I made the Putin interviews. Ukraine has banned me, I believe. They've been very tough on people who are critical. I think the Russian people have been very special to me. I'm perhaps because of my European upbringing, but I enjoy talking to them. I find them very open, very generous, and they appreciate support. They appreciate people who say, I understand why your government is doing this or this or this. I've tried to stay open-minded and listen to both sides. The thing that I have seen as an American is, of course, this American enmity towards Russia from the very beginning. I grew up in 1940, 46, I was born. In the 50s, it was so anti-Russian. They were everywhere. They were in our schools, they were in our State Department, they were spying on us, they were stealing the country from us. That was the way the American right wing, not even the right wing, I'd say the Republican Party, pictured the Russians. They were actively engaged in infiltrating America and changing our thinking. And television shows were based on this. It was very much the J. Edgar Hoover mentality that communism was even behind the student protests of the 1960s. This was the direction in which the FBI and the CIA were thinking. So I grew up with a prejudice. And it took me many years. My father was a Republican, and he was a stockbroker.
I can't seem to learn his
even he,
patterns.
Because he was a World War II soldier, he was a colonel, had fallen under the influence. In order to be successful in American business in the 1950s, you had to have a very strong anti-Soviet line. Very strong. You wouldn't get ahead if you expressed any kind of let's end this Cold War, any kind of activity of that nature. You'd be cast aside as a pinko or somebody who was not completely on the board with the American way of doing business, which was capitalism works, communism doesn't.
And in particular, communism is embodied by the Soviet Union, is the enemy. So hence.
Yeah, that's the way you were.
The narrative behind the Cold War.
That's correct, and it basically lasted. I mean, you saw the ups and downs of it. When Reagan came in, I was well, first of all, we had the crisis of 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis, and Kennedy proved himself to be a warrior for peace. He resolved that with Khrushchev. That was a big moment, huge moment, and people don't give him credit enough for really saving us from a war that could have affected all of mankind.
But it still didn't avert.
No, because the moment he was killed, honestly, there was a lot of, we can talk about that. As you know, I've made a film, JFK Revisited is a documentary we released this year about the movie I made in 1991. But the moment he was killed, I would argue that Lyndon Johnson went back immediately to the old way of thinking, the old way of doing business, which was the Eisenhower Truman way, which we had adapted since World War II. That was an interim. You have to think about it from Roosevelt dies in 1945. Roosevelt has an interim of 15 years where he has more of a democratic regime, more liberal. He recognizes the Soviet Union for the first time since the revolution, and he actually has a relationship with them. He sends ambassadors who are friendly, and he has a relationship with Stalin, etc. And at Yalta, and at Tehran rather, is where he had the relationship.
Do you think if JFK lived, we would not have a Cold War?
No, absolutely not. And we go into great depth on that in the film, and I'd urge you to see it because it goes into all the issues around the world. Kennedy was being very much an anti-imperialist, it turns out, and many people don't understand that, but you have to look at all his policies in Middle East. With Nasser, he had a relationship with Sukarno in Indonesia. With Latin America, he made a big effort with the Alliance for Progress. And when Africa, above all, with Lumumba, he was very shocked at his death and tried to defend the integrity of the Belgian Congo with Dag Hammarskjöld of the UN. He made a big effort. Unfortunately, it didn't work out because Dag Hammarskjöld was killed and then Kennedy was killed. And Congo descended into the chaos of Joseph Mobutu's dictatorship. But Kennedy was very active in terms of, as an Irishman, not as an Englishman. He was an Irishman. And I say that because, well, we'll come back to that, because Mr. Joe Biden is an Irishman, but it's a different kind of an Irishman. They're both Catholic Irish, but Kennedy really made an effort to change the imperialist mindset that it still was very strong in America and Europe. Lyndon Johnson changed back to the old policy, and we were never able to really keep détente going with the Russians. Briefly had it with Carter, but then Brzezinski came in. Brzezinski was his national security advisor. He was put there by Rockefeller, and Brzezinski was a Pole. He got revenge from Poland. Poland has always been attacking Russia, as far as I remember, back to another century. I mean, the two world wars that occupied Russia, and so tragically, entry points were always through Poland and Ukraine. So Brzezinski got his revenge, and Carter ended up being an enemy of the Soviet Union and creating, as Brzezinski took pride in it, he created the atmosphere, the trap for the Soviets to go into Afghanistan in 1979. That trap was set, he said, in 1978. So there was never, except for brief moments, periods of détente with the Soviets. And I grew up under that. I didn't really know anything of this going on because I was learning. I was educating myself as I was learning movies and trying to be a dramatist and this and that. So I wasn't thinking about this. Then when Reagan came in, I was worried again because it was a beat of the old beat, which was there, the most evil empire. I mean, it goes on in American history. It doesn't end. Reagan got a lot of points for that, and of course when Gorbachev came in, it was a beautiful moment for the world. It was a great surprise. It was probably the best years for America, at least from my point of view, in terms of this relaxation in the mood. 1986 to 1991 were great years in terms of ability to believe, once again, that there could be a peace dividend. But the world changed again in 1991, 92. There's an internal mechanism. Who knows? You could blame the United States. You could blame Russia for it. Gorbachev was perhaps not the right man to try to administer that country at that point. He had great visions. He was a man of peace. But it was very difficult to hold together such a huge empire.
So vision is not enough to hold together the Soviet Union?
I think the details are interesting. I've followed up on that a little bit because I was recently in countries like Kazakhstan, talked about the negotiations that were going on and the breakup of the Soviet Union. It's a very interesting story because it involves everything. Ukraine, of course, everything that's going on now. 30 million Russians were left outside of the Soviet Union when it collapsed. They had no home anymore. They were homes in other countries, such as in Ukraine. So it's an interesting story and with repercussions today. Mm-hmm. Kazakhstan is a good example of keeping a balance, keeping it neutral.
Yeah.
He played both sides, and he because Yeltsin wanted him to join the Russian Confederation in a certain way where
did this
he'd be supporting against Gorbachev. There's a whole inward battle there. I think the Ukraine came along with Yeltsin as well as I'm sorry, I don't remember now, but two other regions came with him, and that was the bloc that broke up the Soviet Union. It was Yeltsin's plan to. And it wasn't make the Russian Federation, and they did.
I would love to return back to JFK eventually, because he's such a fascinating figure in the history of human civilization. But let me ask you, fast forward, in 2000, Yeltsin was no longer president, and Vladimir Putin became president. Yeah. You did a series of interviews with Vladimir Putin, as you mentioned, over a period of 2 years, from 2015 to 2017. Let me ask with a high-level question. What was your goal with that conversation?
Came out in 2017. I guess I started them in 2014. At that point, the Snowden affair had happened, and I was working on a movie on Snowden. That happened in 13. Ukraine happened in 14. And one thing after another. By 14... Putin was enemy becoming a wanted man on the American list. He was enemy. He was certainly in the top 5. But the animosity towards Putin had been growing since 2007 at Munich. I remember that speech when he made it. It's in my documentary. That's a 4-hour documentary. 4 different conversations. I mean, we talked over 2 years, 2.5 years. But I remember that image of him at Munich making a very important speech about world harmony, about the balance necessary in the world. And I remember the sneer on John McCain's face. He was in Munich, obviously eyeballing Putin and hating him. And it was so evident that McCain had no belief whatsoever that he was almost treating them like these are the communists are back. And we know that Putin was not a communist. We know that Putin is very much a market man. And he made it very clear and tried to keep an open climate, a new relationship with Europe. But the United States certain people in the United States always saw that as a threat, like Putin is trying to take Europe away from us, as if we own it, as if we have the right to own it. But Putin was making the point, it's very important, about sovereignty. And sovereignty for countries is crucial for this new world to have balance. That's sovereignty for China, sovereignty for Russia, sovereignty for Iran, sovereignty for Venezuela, sovereignty for Cuba. This is an idea that's crucial to the new world, and I think the United States has never accepted that. Sovereignty is not an idea that they can allow. You have to be obedient to the United States idea of so-called democracy and freedom. But it's much more important is sovereignty for these countries, and the United States has not obeyed that, has not even acknowledged it, and it never comes up.
So from the perspective of the United States, when power centers arise in the world,
yes,
you start to oppose those, not because of the ideas, but merely because they have power.
Isn't that at the heart of the doctrine of the neoconservatives? In the Pact for the New American Century, they wrote that in 1996-7. they said there shall be no emergence of a rival power. It was very clear it was about power. And they've stuck to that doctrine, which is if you start to get dangerous in any way or have power, we're going to knock you out. Now, that won't work, but I don't believe it can work. And that is, unfortunately, a policy the United States is following. And the neoconservative group, which is very small, but it's very strong, apparently, and their idea has resonated. It was behind the George Bush's invasion of Iraq. It was part of not only Iraq, but cleaning out the whole world, draining the swamp, going to Afghanistan first, and then, although Iraq had nothing to do with al-Qaeda's attack, going after Iraq. And of course, 60-some other countries where terrorism had some signs of, wherever America judged would be a dangerous country, we had the right, you're either with us or against us. Now, that is a disastrous policy and led to one thing after another. The Iraq War never learned a lesson. The neoconservatives were never fired, never thrown out of office. The people who prosecuted that war are still around. Many of them are still around, and they're obviously guiding America now.
Let me return to this question of power.
Don't forget the sneer that I saw there. That emblemized the United States reaction. Also, there were several other American representatives who were laughing, kind of mocking Putin. It was very serious. I felt there was a divide there. So, since then, I mean, in a certain sense, the Europe reaction to Putin is crucial, and they were more with him back then. And a big thing for America was always to keep NATO, to keep Europe in its pocket as a satellite. And with this recent war, of course, they've succeeded in all beyond their dreams. The Russians have fulfilled the fantasy of the United States to finally be this aggressor that they have pictured for years.
Yeah,
we can talk about that later.
But at that time, there was Europe had significant support for Putin.
Yes.
And the United States was sneering at Putin.
That's correct. You can say that.
And then, so there's this. There was uncertainty as to the direction, as to the future of Russia, and that's exactly when you interviewed Vladimir Putin.
I wanted to know what they thought, because we couldn't get the information war that the United States was fighting against Russia was in evidence back then. It was full out. The condemnation of Russia on all fronts. I never saw a positive article about Putin, and although when I traveled in the world, and I traveled a lot doing documentaries, it was very clear in the Middle East, in Africa, in Asia, there was respect for him. That he was a man who was getting his job done in the interests of Russia. He was, as I said in the documentary, a son of Russia, very much so, in the positive sense, a son of Russia. Not that he's out there trying to destroy the interests of other countries. No, that he was out there to promote the interests of Russia, but at the same time keep a balance, keep the world into a harmony. This has always been his picture. Peace was always his idea. In other words, he always referred to the United States in all these interviews as our partners. And I said, will you stop using that word? They're not.
Well,
and he was a little bit slow in waking up.
I did this, I didn't get invaded all these times. I don't understand.
Well, that said, he's one of the most powerful men in the world. He was at that time. And let me ask you the human question. As the old adage goes, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Did you see any corroding effects of power on the man? Forget the political leader, on just the human being that carries that power on his shoulders for so many years.
Keep in mind that he's been, unlike most modern leaders, he's been in office off and on, because Medvedev was president, and he was not literally in charge. He took another appointment at that point, but he was still very much involved. But for 20 years, more or less, he's been at the administrator of the state, the protector of the state. And he's apparently done a good enough job that the Russian people have kept him there. Because contrary to what many people think, I really believe that if the Russian people didn't want him, he would be out. I firmly believe that. I don't think you can go against the will of the people. Now, it expresses itself in many ways, at the ballot box and so forth, but also in other ways in Russia. There's a strong currents of opinion. So contrary to what the position of him as a dictator, he wouldn't last if he was unpopular, number one. Number two, Russia is much more divided than people know. There's other factors in Russia. There are always tensions in around the Kremlin, who has power, who doesn't have power. That's been going on for 100 years. But the factions in Russia are very much there. So when people refer to Russia as Putin, they're mistaken. And they do this regularly in the New York papers and all this. They say, Putin did this, Putin did that, Putin's doing that. But it's Russia that's doing it. And that's what, there's a distinction there it's changed. In the old days, I would read about Khrushchev, but it was never Khrushchev personally. It was about the Soviet Union. There was respect for a country. And now, when it started to get personal with Putin, it changed, and our thinking changed in a negative way. We no longer respected it as a country. We were seen it as a man, and the man we had trashed repeatedly as a poisoner, as a murderer, and none of which has ever been proven, but which has always been repeated and repeated to the point at which it becomes like an Orwell mantra. It becomes like, he is, of course, the bad guy.
Can I just ask you, as a great filmmaker, as a human being, what was it like talking to one of the most powerful men in the world?
Honestly, and I'm not naive, I've talked to a lot of powerful people. In the movie business, there are powerful people, yes, and many of them are corrupted. I've talked to many people in my life. I've been in the military. I've had other jobs. I have to say, I found him to be a human being. I just found him to be reasonable, calm. I never saw him lose his temper, and I mean, you have to understand that most people in the Western way of doing business get emotional. I don't see that. I saw him as a balanced man, as a man who had studied this like you have. There's a calmness to you, but it comes from studying the world and having a rational response to it. It's interesting. His two daughters, one of them is very scientific, and the other one's doing very well in another profession. But they're a thinking family. His wife too was. I can't talk for the new wife because I don't know about it. But he kept his family with great respect. He's raised his daughters right. He served Yeltsin the way he looked at it. He served Yeltsin well, and he never trashed Yeltsin. Certainly, a lot of people did. But I asked him repeatedly, was he an alcoholic, this or that? But he wouldn't even go that far. He just respect. And this man Yeltsin was in many ways ridiculed, by the Russians. And he turned over the power because he felt like he was overwhelmed. He turned over the power to this man because why? How many people had he fired before him? Several prime ministers, this, that. Why did he turn power over to Mr. Putin? Because he respected him for his work ethic and his balance, his maturity. And that's what I can say is I saw in him. A poor person, from a poor family who worked his way up through the KGB. Americans keep saying he's a KGB agent, but it's like saying, George Bush was a CIA agent. But, he became you grow in your life. And he went from the KGB to this technocratic position. He dealt with many problems, including the Chechnyan War, which is a very difficult situation, as well as the Russian submarine problem. Several things happened early in that gave him a lot of experience. And he handled them all pretty well.
Do you think he was an honest man?
I do. Now, of course, the question of money, the charges that he's the richest man in the world are ludicrous. He certainly doesn't live like it or act like it. If you're rich, I've been around a lot of rich people in my life. You probably have too. In America, you run into them. So many of them are arrogant.
I'm actually good friends now with the richest man in the world.
Oh, of course. I saw your interview with Mr. Musk, who I appreciate. At least he speaks freely. I'm positive about him owning Twitter because Twitter has become censorship city, as has all the major tech. I mean, the censorship that we are now seeing in the United States is so un-American. and shocking to me.
And he is a resistance to that. That is true.
Yeah, I like Musk for that, just for that only. But I also appreciate his adventuresome, his nature, and his desire to explore the world and to ask questions.
Yeah, there's certain ways you sound when you speak freely. There's certain ways a man sounds when he speaks freely.
Yeah.
And he speaks freely. And it's refreshing.
Yeah.
No matter whether you're rich or not, it doesn't matter. When you speak freely, it's a beautiful thing.
Actually, Musk, a major point on going back to nuclear energy, he never believed in it at first, apparently. He was going for batteries, right? And he put a lot of money into batteries. He made them bigger and bigger batteries, but it just, as Bill Gates has said, it's not going to get us there.
Yeah.
And now I think Musk is on another path. He understands the need for nuclear.
Yeah, he's a supporter of nuclear. We're jumping around.
Putin never asked for one thing. Never. It was an interview. It was free form. Ask anything you want. No restrictions, no rules. As with Castro, frankly, Castro did the same thing as did Chavez. So I've had good luck in interviewing free-ranging subjects, people willing to express themselves. He's much more guarded than Castro or Chavez, because, as you know, he's setting government policy when he speaks, and anything he says can be taken out of context.
But there was no restrictions on what to talk about, none of that.
Nor any desire to see anything before we published it. No need to check it with them. It was a completely...
Do you think he watched the final product?
Yes, I do, but I don't think he made judgments on it. I think he was pleased. He doesn't go either way. You see, he's pleased. I mean, it went well, and he's happy for us. But I don't think he had great enthusiasm, expressed it to me. He trusted me, and you could see the way he dealt with me each time. He warmed up to me. 4 times, the first time I might have been a little stiff. You're asking, you don't know who you're dealing with, and so forth. I understand that. But he's used to it now. He's done a lot of press. The worst press he's done, frankly, has been the American press. And not because of his fault, but because of the way they have treated him. If you look at the interviews, they're awful. They first of all, I noticed one thing as a filmmaker right away. They use an overdub. They put a Russian speaker for everything he says, who's much harsher. He speaks Russian in a much harsher manner than actually Putin does. Yeah. On my interview, I left him in his original language with translator. And I think that's important because he expresses himself very clearly and calmly. When you listen to the American broadcast, it's a belligerent person who looks like he's about to bang his shoe on the table. And secondly, the questions are highly aggressive from the beginning. There's no sense of rapport. There's no sense of, it's why, Mr. Putin, did you poison this person? Why, Mr. Putin, did you kill this person? Why are you a murderer? I mean, it's blunt, negative television.
Yeah, it's not just aggressive. So I obviously speak Russian, so I get to appreciate both the original and the translation. And it's not just aggressive, it's very shallow. Oh. They're not looking to understand. No. To me, aggression is okay if that's the way you want to approach it, but there should be underlying kind of empathy for another human being in order to be able to understand. And so some of the worst interviews I've ever listened to is by American press of Vladimir Putin. So NBC and all those kinds of organizations. It's very painful to watch.
And you saw the reception to the Putin interviews in America was hostile without seeing it. So many people criticized my series without having seen it. Even I went on a television show with this famous Colbert. He's very famous in America. And I was shocked on the show to find out that he hadn't seen anything of the 4 hours. He was just attacking Putin. And through me, I was complicit. Therefore, I was a Putin supporter. And the show was a disaster. It's one of my worst television shows. I had to just shut up and get off the air. I mean, at some point, it was embarrassing. Because the audience, too, was clapping for Colbert on anything he said.
Well, as an interviewer in that situation, because between you and Vladimir Putin, there was camaraderie, there was joking, there was... Yeah. Are you worried? Do you put that into the calculation when you're making a film with somebody that could be lying to you, that could be evil. When you talk about Castro, you talk about, so are you worried about how charisma of a man across the table from you can
No, I take
you?
that into account. I absolutely take that into account. I know, doing Castro, he's a wonderful speaker. He's charismatic. So is Chavez.
Yes.
Look at those interviews. I took it into account. But Putin doesn't play that game. He doesn't charm you. He doesn't try to overwhelm you with his bon ami at all. He just says, okay, ask your question. I'll give you my answer straight. Here it is. And he analyzes it. This is the history of NATO. This is the history of our relationship with the United States. How many times have we tried to talk to them about such and such and such and such, and each time we get nowhere? In fact, it's I would like to get along with the United States so much. He's saying it so clearly in all his words.
So, to play devil's advocate.
But he's not making a big deal about it.
But there is a charisma in the calmness.
Yes, there is.
So, let's just calm everything down. It's simple facts. That you can,
yes,
you can call. So there's the Hitler thing, which is screaming, being very loud, charismatic, strong message, and so on. And then there's a Putin style. I'm not comparing those two. There's the Putin style communication of calmness.
Yeah.
And that, at least to me, my personality, that can be very captivating. Is bringing everything down. The facts are simple, but then when